Hi everybody, this is Ken from Soterion, and you're listening to the SAP Security and GRC podcast with host Dudley Cartwright, helping you on your journey to effective access risk management in SAP. In today's episode, we'll be discussing the importance of clearly defining composite roles and business roles. We also look at a few of the challenges that will come with not defining appropriate roles. We'll be joined by Emile Steyn from Soterion and Quintus Hougaard from Linkies Consulting. Thank you for joining us.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to today's podcast. Thanks, guys, once again for joining us, and looking forward to this conversation. Okay, so I think to begin, we'll just, if we look at the secure and effective GRC pyramid, we've always been very vocal about this pyramid, where we illustrate that at the base of the pyramid, we've got policies and procedures. Just above that layer or that component, we've got a role design. And so we've say how important it is for those two components to work well. They form the foundation of all things GRC. So if an organization doesn't have clearly defined policies and procedures, and if they don't have a well-defined or appropriate role design, the organization is just not going to extract the value they should from the GRC investment. Today's talk is specifically then on the role design, and in particular talking about composite roles and business roles, how to get those right, why it's important, and the challenges if we don't get that right. Maybe before I begin, Emile, you could just explain a little bit about the difference between, in that role design layer, we are talking about the SAP single role, and as well as also the composite role / business role. Now, the composite role and the business role perform a similar function, although they generally are sort of handled with two different applications. They're still a data container, I guess. But for today's talk, we're going to be talking about both composite roles and business roles, almost as if they are one.
Right. So, to start off with the single roles. Single role is historically the container for transaction codes. And what we've seen historically is most companies do a pretty good job in defining those single roles, in defining smaller roles. That's typically segregation of duty free. So then in combining or providing users with access, that can then become a single role assignment to user and multiple single role assignment to users. Now, what a lot of companies have tried to achieve is standardization of access, and the way in which you can then standardize access is by using composite roles or then business roles. So that, as you mentioned there, the composite role and the business role becomes the container of access, where you would then add your single roles into the composite or business role. Now, both composite roles and business roles have their pros and cons, but there are some key differences between it. So as a SAP composite role, that being the container of the single roles, that will be system specific. And unfortunately, when you need to do any potential remediation, you can't take a single role out of a composite role as easily, because you affect all the users that's assigned to the composite role. Compare that to the business role. The business role is the container as well, but that can be across many different SAP systems, containing single roles from all of those different underlying systems, and then being more flexible than the composite, where certain roles within the business role can be optional and then can be taken away from individual users without affecting the container of the business role.
The idea then of the composite role of the business role is to try and improve efficiencies. Okay, so it's a collection of roles from multiple systems that in the join of move leaver process or the provisioning process, if someone joins, you can assign a composite role or a business role, and all the underlying or associated roles from the various systems get assigned to that user. So the primary objective there is to try and assist with the efficiencies of the provisioning process. Then, Quintus, I guess that does come at the risk, though, of effective risk management, because as you try and improve these efficiencies with these data containers of composite roles, business roles, it does also mean that you potentially can introduce quite a bit of additional risk into the solution. And I think we've seen a number of organizations that have got very well-defined SAP single roles, but the way in which those single roles have been rolled up to make up the composite role or the business role, that's where it often goes wrong. And users end up with very inappropriate access because of the amount of unused or unnecessary roles that are included or contained in that business role or that composite role. And so as much as you strive to try to improve efficiencies, it does come at the cost of potentially adding additional access risk to the solution.
Dudley, I fully agree. And I think, like you said, most companies have good intentions when they start this process. And just moving a bit back, before the composite role was there, the job role was a big single role. And many people make the mistake, they build this composite role, which just effectively replaced the old big job role that we had as a single role, still having the same problems. You're still having the fact that people are getting more access than they intend to have. But the intentions are good. You want to standardize. But it's that balance of standardization you need to take as to where the cutoff point is. Like you said, introducing additional risk. Emile's point of having 10 people sharing the same role, and then how you're losing flexibility with the composite role, which the business role, as Emile explained, give you more flexibility. But also the downside of that, then, apart from just introducing the extra risk, is that you also obviously it becomes very difficult for a business owner, and we know from our experience that if you don't have ownership in your solution, that's where your problems start. But if you introduce a lot of risk in a role, and the business owner must take ownership of something that they don't really believe in, because there's wider access in what their people need. So the recommendation there is rather cut those business roles or the composite roles into smaller roles. That entrenches your ownership, number one, it reduces your risk. And thirdly, also, it can have a knock-on effect on your licensing, because you're now giving people more access than they need to do, and therefore have a double knock-on effect in your licensing. And another point is obviously when you get to the periodic business reviews, that also have a knock-on effect on that. So all good intention, the way it starts, that obviously just making sure that it's fit for purpose, and rather go smaller than bigger, because you're going to facilitate problems.
And maybe we just need to elaborate a little bit there on that business ownership there. So we've seen that it is more difficult to get business role ownership for badly or inappropriate roles, because that owner is just saying, I'm not taking responsibility for this very wide role that can provide the users with much more access than what they need to carry out to perform their job function. How can I take ownership of this? So there's business resistance to ownership if those roles are inappropriate wide and potentially can allow the users to perform much more than what they need to do. Those business users don't want to be responsible for that. So I think, as you said there, Quintus, it is difficult to get appropriate business role ownership if those are badly created composite roles or business roles that are very wide and provide the user inappropriate access. So
yeah, I think that's why also the advice is to go smaller roles. Because the problem is, once you lose your business, and you don't get him on board, rather get him on board in the beginning and let him stay with you. There's a bit more effort in defining more smaller business roles, but so be it. That's a once-off exercise, And Emile was also referring to, and I think you mentioned, to the joiner lever mover process. So that knock-on effect, have it more smaller and more focused. A little bit more effort in the design, but then a lot of benefits coming from that, especially like you say, to gain the business trust once you lost it is very difficult.
And then for any organization that's placing a lot of emphasis on effective access risk management, they do need to consider, obviously defining or designing appropriate roles, because they can't be just chasing efficiencies with these inappropriate roles. They have to also then be saying, okay, but how do we achieve the efficiencies, but in a more controlled manner? And the only way to do that is by ensuring that the business role or the composite role is appropriate for that group of users. Otherwise they're just not going to be able to manage their risk effectively. So, so I just also then thought maybe, Emile, to maybe just explain, why traditionally has it been so difficult? Why do we see so many organizations having got great single role designs, but when that's rolled up into the composite role or the business role, that's where the authorization solution effectively loses shape? Why does it seem to be such a challenge to define these composite roles or business roles for a group of users, that role ends up being appropriate for that group of users?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things, and what we typically see is almost coming back to the start. How do you start in defining these roles? So it's usually based on the HR feed. So based on the HR information, what job does this person do? Then trying to group those people together and then building a role that's specifically aimed at them. Now, what we have seen is that in a lot of organizations, the HR job function is very much different from what people are actually doing in the SAP system. So to use the HR feed only typically results then in a badly designed business role. So you need to ensure that the business role you're building is based on the function that people are actually performing in SAP. And that's where items like usage information becomes very important, that you can identify what are people actually doing in the system so that you can build a business role that's specific to them. And that will also then ensure that there's not unnecessary over allocation of access.
So just to maybe elaborate on that, I guess then take an example of that. So if the HR feed says there are 10 accounts payable clerks in the business, but in practice, 2 of them are performing quite different functionality in SAP compared to the other 8. The challenge that you've got when you build those roles often is you go and take those group of 10 users and you go and look at everything that they've got or that they've used, and you go and group that access together into one role and say, this is my accounts payable clerk role. But the challenge is if 2 of those users were performing very different functionality to the other 8 users, the other 8 inherit everything that those 2 are using. So that's why these roles end up being so big. So I guess then it's also then, if you can bring in the usage data, that you can see what the users are using, that you could try and look for the outlier activities and see if you can ring fence those users, or do they belong to a different role? Can their usage be excluded? But I guess also then important that if you are using the HR feed as your source or base feed, that you still consult with the line managers, because they will know on the ground, even if HR says that person is an accounts payable clerk, the line manager will go say, no, he's actually doing something quite different to the rest of the users. Let's handle him separately. So it's quite difficult to create or do these projects without some input from the business or the line managers who know the users. It's very, very difficult, to go and define do these projects just based on the HR feed, and with no involvement from the users, sort of line managers, who know what those users are actually doing in the SAP system. So maybe it's a combination of taking the usage information so you can see what the users are actually using in the system, also consulting with that group of users, line managers, to make sure that group of users are performing that function, and it makes sense that all their activities are grouped together.
Dudley, I think one of the appropriate points there is the combination of, I think what Emile is saying, that the HR dictating, what the job role is, and we know that misalignment between what's happening in SAP and what the job role, the person's role is on the HR system. And I think it becomes more relevant when you work in a company, and we've got examples of clients like a hospital group which will have a huge hospital in a big metropole city, where they have the ability to split those, the receiving clerks and doing the medical claims. It's done by different people doing those different jobs. But when you get to the smaller hospital in the rural area, there's 1 or 2 people doing all those combined together. But in the back in the HR system, they all have the same position.
Right.
And so those decentralized approach that clients must take into consideration when they have this, especially multinationals where they operate in smaller areas, to make and that's back to your point where the line manager comes in. And I think then you have to make a decision. Do you give that person multiple job roles? If you stick to your small job roles, that have other effects. We also can discuss, if you do, but or rather, do you build a new job role and specifically aimed at those smaller guys. But that's another pitfall I've seen many clients step in by this decentralized approach.
I'll maybe just add another option in there is that you can then also consider the flexibility of your business role, where you can build a larger business role, but with optional roles instead of mandatory ones, where you have the ability then to take or assign portion of a business role or subsequently remediate certain single roles from individual users that don't actually require that access.
That's brilliant, Emile. And I think that's the big difference between the composite role and the business role. Because in the composite role, you don't have that flexibility. You paint yourself in a corner there. Where the business role gives us that flexibility to do that. A very good point.
If these roles are sort of badly created, they're providing users with inappropriate access, we've always been seeing how difficult it is to remediate a solution that is based on a SAP composite role or business role design. And the main reason for that being, you obviously need to consider a group of users. So to take a role out of a composite role, you're not looking at that in isolation of one user. You've got to consider that based on all the users that have that composite role. So just maybe that also places more importance on getting the design right and making sure that those roles are appropriate, because if they're not, if you don't spend the effort in defining those roles, making sure they're appropriate for that group of users, it's very difficult to retro correct or fix those type of solutions, because cleaning up a composite role design or a business role design is always more challenging because of the requirement of you needing to consider a group of users who have that role. Any change to that composite role will affect all the users that have got that. So it's always a much more challenging sort of solution to remediate, and that's why often you can't do much about it. So once it's in, you then end up living with that solution for many years. So just hence placing a lot of importance on the initial design of those rules. Okay.
Yeah, and I think the advice would be to clients I've just recently done a project, and we actually I've actually told the client, please rather spend more effort. Let's even if we have to delay this project by by a couple of weeks or days or whatever the case, to get that right. So put that effort in defining those roles up front and get that right. And there's the battle here is between standardization and then the risk focus. So a lot of, depending who you're talking to, they're going to say, listen, driving efficiency, that's what we must do, and we need to focus on, and therefore standardization is trying to put as many people in the same group as possible. The advice there is don't go that route. Rather focus it to a risk focus right from the beginning. And if that means smaller roles, that means yes, a bit more effort in the beginning. That's the way to go, because like you say, to untangle once you got it in is much more difficult. So rather put that effort in the beginning.
Well, and agree 100%. We very vocal also when we go and do role redesigns at our clients, where we emphasize to the client and saying, listen, the challenge to the project is likely to be is at the phase where, not at the SAP single role build, but it's when you roll those single roles up to the composite role or the business role. If the necessary effort is not put in at that phase of the project, the entire project is potentially can be deemed a failure because of just the whole, the inappropriate access that everyone is likely to be assigned. So I couldn't agree with you more with that. Okay, so then I think Emile, maybe to end with you then, just in conclusion. So recommendations to anyone listening. How do you go about defining appropriate business roles? What are some of the things that you should think about?
First of all, I think HR feed. You need to ensure that your HR feed is appropriate, and spend time fixing the job roles or the HR feed, and making sure that the HR function that has been defined, that you're basing your decisions on, is accurate. Ensuring that you've got enough usage information that you're basing your decisions on. And I think it's an item that you've mentioned a couple of times, is getting the correct business owners involved to actually make a decision based on these users that's going to perform this function. that it's that they ultimately take ownership of the content of that business role, as they will be involved in other areas like user access requests, user access reviews, business role content reviews, so that they are comfortable with the content. They can take ownership of that.
Maybe just on that HR feed, just to add to what you said there, I guess the one option for the customer is to go and update the HR feed to update the job positions. But I'm assuming for a lot of organizations that's a huge effort. Okay, so the other option then is to say, listen, let's leave the HR positions as is, but we know that they're not necessarily reflective of what people are doing in SAP. Therefore, we're going to have slightly different business roles for users in SAP compared to what maybe the HR title is saying. So you adjust it within we create the business role or the business role or the composite role. Not necessarily, you don't need to go and clean up your HR feed with that. You can just rather than say, listen, well, let's just go and define a new business role for this user, and we will just make sure we know who that goes to.
That's a very good point. But I think one of the things that Emile also mentioned is it's a combination of the usage data plus the HR feed. So you have this opportunity then, because what the visibility comes through with the usage records is you'll pick up a lot of people that's doing things they shouldn't be doing. So use this opportunity also to do a bit of a business process, redesign in terms of, listen, this job function is lying there. We know it shouldn't be there because of a risk, from a risk perspective. And be bold enough then to say, listen, I know you've done this, but this is not what this is. Add this to a different business role. You've got this opportunity, make use of it. So what I'm trying to say is that the usage data is not telling you just where to map it. It also gives you some insight as what is wrong actually in your current process, which can be rectified, and also put you in a good way forward, And I think your point of you're going to always have a struggle going back to the HR guys. We must remember that the HR guys, when they design those positions, is really, some people are very sensitive about their job titles and positions they have, and if you're going to mess around with that, that's going to open another can of worms. So rather go to your route and say, listen, we've got underneath this job title, we got 3 or 4 different SAP business roles, and that's what we're going to do. You have less, you can get a bit more buy-in and less kickback from the HR and guys,
No, I agree. So I think we've explained some of the challenges and why it's so difficult for many organizations to go and define composite roles or business roles. Generally, in these podcasts, we don't like to promote software at all, especially our software. But I think in this case, we've just recently developed some amazing functionality that, some role modeling functionality that does this very activity, goes and helps an organization go and identify exactly what a group of users have been using, clearly indicates if there are any outliers within that group, and can compare a user to another group of users to see how similar their functionality is. So we're just going to spend a minute showing you some of that functionality. So this is how Soterion does that activity. This is the Soterion application, and we're going to be looking at the Central Identity Manager module. So this is the module in Soterion where you can go and create business roles and provision those roles to the users. In particular, we're looking at the role modeling submodule within Central Identity Manager. This is where you can go and define or create appropriate business roles or composite roles for a group of users. We've got the option of either using template roles. What we mean by template roles is if you as an organization are busy with a role redesign and you want to make use of new roles that aren't in your SAP system yet, you can upload template roles into the Soterion application, and the design can be based off the new roles that are about to or going to be built in the S4, the SAP environment. If no template roles are uploaded into the Soterion application, then Soterion is going to assume that the design of these business roles or composite roles will be based on the existing SAP roles that are currently reside in the SAP systems. We're now going to go and define the users. Now this will be all the users that are in scope for this project. It could be for all users in the organization, or if you only want to deal with a subset of the users, just upload a smaller set of users. A lot of the functionality that's used for this role modeling is based on the usage information. So it's critical and imperative that we get the transactions in scope correct. So in case some users have used transaction codes historically that they shouldn't have, or if there was a substitution, it's important that we go and clean up the transaction codes that have been used, that we only are making use of the transaction codes that are relevant for this engagement. We can go and exclude some transactions at a global level and a user level. We also have the ability to go and substitute some transaction codes. So as we move to S4, with some of the vendor master, customer master transactions being replaced with BP, we can go and insert what the old transaction code is and what the new transaction code is. We can also go and do that also for Fury apps, or if some of the Fury apps are going to replace some of the transaction codes that are going to be used by the users. With regard to models, we can go and define sort of different departments or business units. We can go and create these models as we wish. In this particular example, we've created these models at a department level. So as an example here, we've got an accounts payable department. We then go and upload or flag all the users that are associated with the accounts payable department. So these are all the users now that belong to accounts payable. We can then go and start creating the business role. And when I say business role, also consider this as a composite role. If you don't want to use Soterion's business role functionality, you can also use this to go and create your composite roles. So you can go and create brand new roles, or I've already got a business role already defined. I'm going to take the accounts payable administrator as the example, and we can see now we're listing all the users that have been linked to the accounts payable department. We now need to go and identify which user is my most ideal accounts payable administrator. So as an example, I'm going to take this particular user here. I can now see all of the roles that this user has executed, or any transaction codes that have been executed, and the roles that contain those transaction codes. I can go and then do some selections to say, should any of these roles not be assigned to the user? Should any of these roles be assigned rather directly to the user and not via the composite role or the business role? What Soterion will then do is, once we've assigned our ideal user, Soterion will then go and categorize or list all the remaining users in this department to how similar they are to our ideal user, i.e. our Victoria Hodges. It will go and sort all the users in descending order as to who is using the most similar functionality to our ideal user. So as an example, we can see Paul Jackson here has used 24 of the same roles as our ideal user. But this user has also gone and used 3 roles that are different to our ideal user. We can go and look at these. Soterion will then display what those 3 roles are, and we can make a decision as to how do we want to handle these 3 roles. Do any of them need to be also assigned to the business role? And if so, are they going to be assigned as a mandatory or a optional role? So once we've also assigned our second user to the business role, Soterion then recalculates all the remaining users in the department based on how similar they are to the roles that now belong to the business role. And so we can then see all the users, how similar they are to what's now making up this accounts payable admin business role. And we can see if any other users also need to be assigned to this business role. We get to a point then, at some point, where a particular user will then be performing such vastly different functionality to what's contained in this business role, that this obviously lends itself to a completely different business role. We wouldn't allocate this user to this business role because we can see that the transactions or the roles that are in use by this user are so different that it wouldn't make sense to assign this role, this user, to the same business role. We should rather create a new business role for that user. Okay, now to go and look at the content of the business role we've created, we can now go and see for our accounts payable administrator, these are all the roles that are now the SAP single roles that are going to be assigned to this business role. We can also, if we've made a mistake, we can go and remove any of these roles. And we can also go and look at this by the business process. So in case your business users don't quite understand the SAP technical roles, we can go and see that this business role has got some FI access, it's got some procure to pay access, and everything highlighted in red is what this business role is able to perform. In case we don't know where this user is getting the ability to do vendor invoice processing or payment run execution, just by selecting that step in the process flow, Soterion will go and filter all the roles that give this business role that ability. We can also go and then see if we've decided to give any of the roles as direct allocations. We can also go and see this, if there's any direct allocations, we can also view that by business process to see which roles are the users getting that is not via the business role, but is coming as a direct allocation. And lastly, we can also go and see what the risk impact of this business role is. We can now see this accounts payable administrator has 32 potential risks. We list the critical transactions and the SODs that are contained in this business role. And we can also then go and list all the SAP single roles that make up this role and the percentage that each of those roles contribute to the overall risk count. And this will allow us to identify, are there any roles that are contributing to too high a percentage, and do we want to maybe get rid of that particular role from that business role because it's contributing to too much risk. Guys, thank you very much for joining us on today's session. Emile, Quintus, thank you very much for your insights, your thoughts. As always, greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Thanks, Dudley. Bye.